Well, I really trust that we weren't talking over anyone's head last week. Some of the looks and gasps, it would appear as if some of you were either under what I was saying or I was over what you were hearing. It's really the same thing, but maybe one of them sounds more positive than the other. I don't know. Hallelujah. Well, I trust that it wasn't over your head, and what we were saying, we'll try to go back with a short amount of time here and see where we were, what we were trying to say in all of this, because we're not going to get through, I don't think, again this evening with this subject before we have time to go on. Now, we're looking at the reasons which necessitated the formation of a canon. We looked at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which was the last of them, which is the one we'll be on again tonight, was the statement because of the close of the two periods of divine inspired revelation. We had Old Testament from 1400 to 400 BC. We had New Testament from AD 45 to AD 95. And because of this reason, we needed to have a canon so that material before the certain times that I've just given would not be included, and so that material that came after this certain time period would also be excluded. But why do we have these particular dates as being the dates for the only divine inspired revelation? They're not arbitrary, let me say that. Anyone can pick an arbitrary date and say nothing before, nothing after. But why these dates? And more specifically, how did the people of that day and how are we today to know that these dates would be the correct dates? Because it's really in answering or in explaining this particular answer to our question, we have to give answers to the answers to questions, at least in this class, because that's how involved it gets. You answer a question with an answer, and then everyone looks at you like, well, what does that answer mean? So then you got to answer your answer. And it's not even supposed to be answered because it wasn't a question, it was an answer. And then you got to answer your answer to the question. So that's what we're in the process of doing, is answering the answers to the answers to this answer to the question of why we had a need for a canon. That is because there was this close to the divine period of revelation when it would be accepted. We looked at 4 post-canonical references from various Jewish writers dating from, a couple of centuries after Malachi to almost 1,000 years after Malachi to see what the post-canonical Jewish frame of mind was concerning the close of the Old Testament canon. First of all, we looked in the Manual of Discipline, which is a couple of centuries after Malachi. And it makes mention of the coming of a prophet and the anointed ones of Aaron and Israel. The subject of the revival of the prophetic line is what is seen in all of these, as well as the close of the prophetic line sometime in the past, and some of our writers tell us when that closed. First Maccabees was our second witness that we looked at in 3 passages, that the author confessed himself that there were no longer prophets in Israel, divine canonical revelation had ceased sometime previously. Then getting more specific, we closed with 2 writers, Josephus, in a rather long, extended quotation from his 4th volume of his celebrated works, which are very important, and you should have a copy of them, which made the statement that this revelation began with Moses and it stopped during the time of Artaxerxes. And we've looked already at that a little bit. We'll look at that again this evening. And finally, the reference in the Talmud, which was more specific than all of them in saying that after the latter prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, then the Holy Spirit departed from Israel, which was the same as saying the last of the prophetic words of those that were first of all prophets and then something else, not something else and secondly a prophet, was the man Malachi and the time of Malachi. Now, we were looking at some of the arguments against these witnesses that the Old Testament really closed 400 BC. These arguments were found in 3 books, Daniel, Nehemiah, and 1 Chronicles. From Daniel, if you'll look in Daniel chapter 11, we mentioned the argument based on the book of Daniel is that the information the prophet Daniel gives concerning the era of the Maccabees is much too precise and on target to have been prophesied by someone 400 years in advance. So for the modernistic skeptic, he's going to rule out Daniel's book, chapter 11, being closed any before 168 BC, so that he would have been a contemporary of the events of the Maccabean Wars and their revolution and attempt for the gaining again of their independence. Too precise, in other words, in what he is saying. Now in chapter 11, verse 2, now I will show thee the truth. Now remember, an angel is the one giving this to Daniel anyway, so an angel ought to know what he's talking about. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, the fourth shall be far richer than they all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up against them the realm of Grecia. And a mighty king, that's Alexander the Great, shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. When he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided among the 4 winds of heaven, where you end up with his 4 generals, Ptolemy and Seleucid and the other generals, where the kingdom was divided. Not to his posterity. Alexander, remember, didn't have a son. So he didn't have posterity, and not according to his dominion, which he had ruled. It was divided, he ruled the whole world. But when it was divided among 4 generals, they only got portions of the whole world. So they ruled, but not according to his dominion. Even for others besides those. The king of the south shall be strong. This is the Ptolemaic kingdom. One of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion, and his dominion shall be great dominion. The end of years they shall join themselves together. This would be the southern and the northern kingdom, or the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid, shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the Ptolemies shall come to the king's daughter of the Seleucid to make an agreement, or to the king of the Seleucids to make an agreement. And on and on and on. It gives us all types of details, all the way down through verse 35, of the time period of Judas and Simon, Maccabeus, and Antiochus Epiphanes, Mattathias, their father, and so forth, which we'll look at some other time, so you don't need to remember all those names. That's the argument from Daniel's book. 400 years before these events taking place. Therefore, the canon couldn't have closed after Malachi, because the events of Daniel 11 come after Malachi, after Malachi's time. All right, you understand that? Amen. Nehemiah's book. 2 arguments from Nehemiah's book. First of all, the Greek coins, the drachmas that are seen in his book, a century before Alexander the Great and his conquering of the world. How do we have Greek coins appearing all the way down in Palestine? We answer that, and the second argument was based on Nehemiah chapter 12 and the succession of high priests, because we're provided a succession of high priests in Nehemiah chapter 12. All the first 26 or so verses are the important verses, and we were beginning to get into this argument, beginning to look at some of the answers. I don't think we'd gotten to answers. We'd gotten to some beginnings of this argument, which went as follows. You have to see this as a step-by-step procedure so that you won't be confused. Nehemiah 12, the portion that the modernistic scholar and critic wants to bring up before us, and therefore the one that we want to look at, the portion of Nehemiah 12 that they are referring to, has to do with the succession of high priests. These high priests are post-exilic high priests. So to do you the favor, last week we went back and gave you the last of the pre-exilic high priests to give you the background for the post-exilic high priest, so you'll see how one follows the other and how this is built up. The last of the pre-exilic high priests was Seraiah, S-E-R-A-I-A-H, 2 Kings 25:18, who was slain by Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. Last of the pre-exilic high priest. Then we have Seraiah's son, who was the only exilic priest. He went into exile. His name was Jehozadak. He went into Babylonian captivity. We're told very clearly in 1 Chronicles 6:15 that Jehozadak went into Babylonian captivity, and he was the son and therefore the immediate high priest after and under Sariah. We said that his name also appears as Josedek in the book of Haggai, chapters 1 and 2. Josedech, Josedek, short O, and Josadak, long O, Jozadak, in Nehemiah chapter 12. Jehozadak, Josedek, and Josadak are all the same, self-same individual. Now he had a very famous son, the most famous of the post-exilic high priests, and that was the high priest Joshua, who appears in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. Now in the former of these four books, Ezra and Nehemiah, his name is always misspelled as Jeshua. Haggai and Zechariah, you always have the proper spelling of Joshua, but it's the self-same individual. This is the famous son of Josadak, the first and most important and most well-known of the post-exilic high priests. Joshua appears in Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah. Ezra, Nehemiah's name's always misspelled as Jeshua, Jeshua. Should always be changed to a J-O. Haggai and Zechariah, we've got the correct spelling. Let's see, if you happen to already be opened to Nehemiah 12, this is where we're going. I can point out a couple of places right away. It's just throughout Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, I've got on the same page chapter 11 and verse 26, Jeshua. Chapter 12 and verse 1, Jeshua. 12 and verse 10, Jeshua. 12:24, Jeshua. 12:26, Jeshua, and so forth. You can run all the references yourself, and you'll find out it's always Jeshua rather than Joshua. And it should be Joshua, so you won't confuse him with the high priest of the books of Haggai and Zechariah. Now, after Joshua, we have our succession of high priests, which present us with the problem. And these run as follows. You can find them on your chart if you don't know how to spell all their names. Joachim, Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, and Jaddua. Those are the only important ones that you need to remember. And they're also found in chapter 12, verses 10 and 11. Joachim, Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, and Jaddua. Now, Jaddua, he's the most important of these that we are covering now. Joshua is the well-known one, but for our critical studies here, Jaddua is the most important one because he is the last Old Testament high priest mentioned. Now, there were Jewish high priests that followed, but not mentioned in the Old Testament. So the first high priest in the Old Testament, of course, was Aaron. The last Old Testament high priest was Jaddua, 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 the high priest. All right, here's where we get into our problem. According to Josephus, Jaddua was high priest from 351 to 331 BC, and he therefore was that famous high priest who came out of Jerusalem when Alexander came by and persuaded Alexander not to destroy Jerusalem and the temple by showing him the prophecies of the book of Daniel, which had said that a strong king will rise up in Greece and will conquer the whole world. And Alexander, just like the Roman Emperor Vespasian, as the prophecy of Josephus himself, Alexander the Great was so impressed with the fact that this Jewish people had a book that had been written a long time before Alexander had ever come on the scene, which had next to told him by name. I mean, not that precise, but it had mentioned a king of Greece that was going to rise up and was going to conquer the Medes and the Persians and take the whole world of his day. And so you can see that Alexander would have been so impressed by that. And according to Josephus, Jaddua was the high priest at this time, and he was so impressed that he spared the city and spared the people their life. Now, remember the dates Josephus gives us, 351, 331 for Jaddua. Our contention, based on the 4 post-canonical Jewish references and witnesses that we studied last week, is that the Old Testament was closed, the canon was closed by 400 B.C. Therefore, how could Nehemiah have Jaddua's name in there when he wasn't going to be high priest for 50 years? That stands out as a sore thumb right away. If Nehemiah, according to these other writers that we've already quoted from, if Nehemiah has to have everything concluded, Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, all of them, all the post-exilic writers, have to be finished by 400 B.C., then how can Jaddua's name be in here when he doesn't become a high priest for 49 years, a half a century later, yet his name slips in here more than once? So evidently, of course, what they're saying, evidently, Nehemiah wasn't really written by this Nehemiah of our day, of this particular day that we are referring to here, because he couldn't have included Jaddua. Therefore, the canon was not closed, and what they're trying to do, if they can break this belief, this Jewish tradition that the canon was closed in 400 B.C., if they can break that, then we can all guess when we want to close the canon, because we're not told anywhere else. We can just all guess. We can put it 200 A.D., which is what some people do for the Old Testament canon, not closed until 200 A.D., when the writings were finally accepted into the Jewish canon. Some of them, of course, being written during the Maccabean time period. When you do a study of the book of Psalms at the hands of critical scholars, the first thing you'll find is that a large number of the Psalms were written during the Maccabean time period, which would be much later than what most of them claim to be written, because the vast majority of them have superscriptions and titles that go with them, telling us that Ethan, or that Jeduthun, or that Moses, or that the sons of Korah, or that Solomon, or of course that David, about half of them David himself was the composer of, has authored these things rather than someone during the Maccabean time period. Now, if you don't know anything about the Maccabeans, I keep using that word, that's 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, so you're getting a lot later time period than what we have to deal with the book of Psalms or with the book of Nehemiah, even though Nehemiah does come later. Now, don't be naive. Most Christians are naive, and they think that David wrote all the Psalms. I just gave you a list of other people that wrote some of the Psalms, and some of the Psalms are post-exilic. I mean, you read the one that says that when we were in Babylon and we hung our harps on the willow tree, that's after Babylonian captivity, you see, for some things like that. So naturally, some of the Psalms are going to be post-exilic. Not very many of them, but there will be a few that would come after these periods of captivity. But not during the Maccabean time period. That's getting too late for it. Well, how can we answer the critics' charge that since Jaddua, according to Josephus, was high priest from 351 to 331, that he simply couldn't be in Nehemiah's book, or Nehemiah, since he is in his book, couldn't have his book finished by 400 B.C. There are a couple of answers that we can give. The first answer, and this is an unlikely answer, is that the name Jaddua could have been added later by what we call redactors, just to bring the list more up to current time standards on the basis of whoever the redactor was. Obviously, he would have been living 351 to 331, and he would simply stick in there the last of the high priests, according to his day. Of course, after him were more high priests, all the way down through Simon and all the way down through John Hyrcanus and the famous high priest during the Maccabean time period. That answer is unlikely. It's been proposed by some, but that answer is unlikely. A second answer is that Josephus could have been mistaken, because it's well known by all scholars, critics and conservatives, that the high priesthood succession during this time period is very hazy. And Josephus, on more than one occasion, appears to be a little confused, especially when it comes to the high priest. Now, some of his other statistics are wrong. But when you get to the end of the 5th century and the beginning of the 4th century B.C., the succession of high priests, which one came to the high priesthood, becomes very hazy. So there is a possibility that Josephus simply was mistaken with his name Jaddua, because remember, he's writing 100 A.D. now. This is 500 years later. When Josephus is sitting down having to write, he's having to use some other sources and some other material here. So maybe he was wrong in his dates. That's unlikely. A third answer is that Josephus could have been speaking of another high priest with the same name. The name wasn't one of the most common names, though. However, it was one that was borne by other men besides the man here in Nehemiah 12. But we have no record of there being a double Jaddua for the high priesthood at any time during Israel's history. There appears to be only one correct answer if we're going to take what Josephus has said to be true. Now remember the first three answers I've given you. All three of them are unlikely, but I'm not saying that if we knew more about that time period and had more material, one of those answers might not be the correct answer, such as Josephus simply being mistaken about what is taking place there, or that we have double Jaddua as a high priest. One in Nehemiah's day, one in Josephus' day. So I'm not saying dogmatically that none of those are right, because we don't have enough material. But neither can a person say dogmatically that Nehemiah's book is wrong, because they don't have enough material either. So you got to be honest. When you can't be dogmatic, you have to be honest. I mean, Jesus is the only way to the Father. You can be dogmatic about that. Amen. And it doesn't matter what anyone says about that. He's the only way, the only truth, the only life. So you can be dogmatic about that. But if you want to know what hour Adam was created, well, we could all guess. We could guess 24 different ones. But that'd all be a guess, though, and we couldn't be dogmatic about it. People have tried to, on the basis of, the mist coming up from the ground. That would probably have to be during the morning time there, when mist would be rising, so it'd be a morning creation, or a night creation, kind of fog there, so it's towards the end of the day that he was created. But that's beside the point. The mist coming up from the ground, and of course that all depends on how you translate that Hebrew word. It appears to be subterranean waters and not some spooky mist that's floating all over the earth anyway. Well, we are boxing ourselves in here. We say the critics are wrong, but we also say all three of our answers are wrong so far. But we do have a last one that we believe to be right. But before I give that, we'll give that next week probably. No, we'll get to it in Before we get to that, let me give you a quick outline of the first half of Nehemiah 12, because before we can properly interpret this line of the succession of high priests, we need to realize what Nehemiah is saying in chapter 12. You don't want to lift something out of context. You want to understand what else is being said here that could give us a hint concerning this particular man named Jaddua. So here's an outline of chapter 12. It deals, we're going to just go through verse 26. Verse 27 starts an entirely new subject. The first 26 verses of chapter 12 are the only ones that we need to concern ourselves with. Verses 1 to 9 give us a list of the priests and Levites who came back to the promised land with Zerubbabel. Now that's all that verses 1 to 9 intend to give us. Now I'll show you this from the first verse. A list of priests and Levites who come back from captivity to the promised land with Zerubbabel. Verse 1, now these are the priests and the Levites that went up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, Sariah, Jeremiah, Ezra. Now these are different Jeremiahs and Ezra than you know, different Sariah as a matter of fact. You've seen all three of those names, but different ones. Amariah, Malach, Haddish, Shechaniah, Rehum, Merimoth, Iddo, Ginnetho, Abijah, Miamin, and so forth. And he goes down through verse 9, and he's telling us in the very first phrase of the first verse, now these are the priests and the Levites that return from the captivity with Zerubbabel. So we know what verses 1 to 9 provide. Verses 12 through 21 provide us with the heads of the priestly houses in the days of Joachim. The heads of the priestly houses in the days of Joachim. Now, who's Joachim? He's the second one. Joshua, Joachim, Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, Jaddua. That's the way in which they go. He's the second one. So he would be the son of Joshua, the great high priest, would be Joachim. Now we're told this in verse 12. In the days of Joachim were the priests, the chief of the fathers. So he's giving us those heads of houses. Of Sariah, Meriah, of Jeremiah, Hananiah. So he's giving us the different priestly houses, who was the head of that priestly house. That continues on down through verse 21. Then in verses 22 through 26, we have the heads of Levite houses in the days of, let's see, Joachim, the days of Nehemiah, and the days of Ezra. They're found in verse 26, the days of Joachim, the days of Nehemiah, the days of Ezra. That covers a rather long time period there. So these are the heads of the Levite houses and families, the days of Joachim, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Now, if you'll notice in verse 22, you see verse 26 is the summation of the whole thing, saying that these were in the days of Joachim, the son of Joshua, the son of Josadak, and in the days of Nehemiah the governor, and of Ezra the priest, the scribe. That's what he's trying to get across, that these were the heads of the Levite families during these days. But to begin with, and this is one of the important verses, and that's verse 22, he again says, these are the Levites in the days, and now he's going to give us some more individuals here. These are the heads of Levite houses and families. That's what he's meaning here. In the days of Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, and Jaddua. Now there's Jaddua's name stuck in there. This is the first time that, well, anyway, that we pointed out here. He's seen earlier in the chapter the verses that we skipped, but here's the first time we pointed out where Jaddua's name appears. And he, remember, is the one who presents the anachronism, according to the critical scholars. Now, the verses that we skipped, verses 10 and 11, simply give us the succession of high priests. That's why we can't include them in 1 to 9, 12 to 21, or 22 through 26, although part of that is repeated in verse 22. The purpose of verses 10 and 11 is to give us the post-exilic succession of high priests. And it's given to us very plainly. We do need to make a change in one of the names here. Besides Joshua, verse 10, it's not Jeshua, it's Joshua. Joshua begat Joachim. Now you see, if you didn't know this, you wouldn't know who he's talking about here. But here he's talking not about the heads of Levite families, not about the heads of priestly families, and not about the regular priests and Levites that went back with Zerubbabel. Those are the three divisions we've given you of the first half of the chapter so far. We start off with just the lay Levite, so to speak, the lay priest that went back with Zerubbabel. And then after skipping verses 10 and 11, we get down to looking at the heads of priestly families and the heads of Levite families. But placed in the middle of all this, the most important thing to know during this whole time period is, well, who are the high priests? One after another during this time period, and that's what's provided in verses 10 and 11. Joshua begat Joachim. Joachim also begat Eliashib. Eliashib begat Joiada. Joiada begat Johanan. Jonathan shouldn't have gotten into the text like that, because we're told down in verse 22 that the man's name was not Jonathan, but his name was Johanan, and that's spelled for you down in verse 22. So it's generally agreed on both sides of the fence that Jonathan is the wrong name to be in here. It should be Johanan. If you don't take that out, then you're presented immediately in verse 22 with a contradiction. Whereas you've got Joiada and his son Jonathan in verse 11, you've got Joiada and his son Johanan in verse 22, and although Joiada obviously can have two sons, he can't have two that are high priests. Only your firstborn can pass down as the high priest. So you've got to change one of them. One of them is wrong, and we know the one, Jonathan, in verse 11 to be wrong. So Joiada begat Johanan, and Johanan begat Jaddua. Now there's the first time, the second we've told you about, but the first in the chapter that Jaddua's name appears. Now the first thing that I have to state in giving you what we feel to be the correct answer to this problem is that Nehemiah himself had to have known Jaddua, or Jaddua's name would not have gotten in his book. However, Nehemiah says nowhere that Jaddua was a high priest during his lifetime, that is, during Nehemiah's lifetime. It simply lists these, Nehemiah knowing ahead of time that with Jaddua being the firstborn son of Johanan, he would obviously end up in the succession of high priests because he would be the firstborn son, therefore he would end up as high priest. But he is not calling him a high priest during his time period, you see. For the being the firstborn son of Johanan, he would obviously end up in the succession of high priests because he would be the firstborn son, therefore he would end up as high priest. But he is not calling him a high priest during his time period, you see. As a matter of fact, Nehemiah is living a little earlier than would reach down to this period. That, of course, all depends on when you want to date these different high priests. Let me ask you a question. Do you remember when we studied earlier? Let's see. I guess that was during our literature class here, where we looked at the thing known as the Elephantine papyri that have been found on the island of Elephantine across from Aswan in Egypt. And remember, there was some correspondence between some synchronistic Jews that had built a temple there with the high priest back in Jerusalem. Do you remember what his name was? First of all, do you remember what the date was? 410, 408, around that period. And what was the man's name? Johanan was the high priest. And that's in the Elephantine text, you see. There is one of the other extra-biblical things that substantiates the biblical record. We know him to have been a high priest somewhere during this time period. And in the 410, 408 BC time period and area, the Jews worshiping in the temple on Elephantine are writing not only to the sons of Sanballat, and not only to the Persian governor at that time period, but they also have written to the high priest, calling him by name as Johanan, which means that somewhere around the last decade of the 5th century BC, Johanan is going to be the high priest. Now, if you'll open up your Kings and Prophets chart, you'll see that we have listed for us here our succession of high priests in line with our various Old Testament writers, such as Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi, and also in line with the Achaemenid line of Persian kings, which you'll find up above. But you'll also notice that you have question marks under all of them here because they're not for certain that this is right. Now, they've adopted one view. The authors of our chart have adopted one view concerning Jaddua being high priest. And what they have adopted is that Nehemiah evidently knew Jaddua as high priest because, you see, Jaddua is becoming high priest around 404 BC, and therefore that would just barely fit in within 4-year time period to the belief in the close of the Old Testament canon at the year 400 BC. It would fit in by 4 years. But question marks under all of this. Now, my position is this is probably incorrect. We know his dating here of Johanan has to somehow be correct because it's got to extend around the time period 410, 408 because the Elephantine papyri lists the high priest in Jerusalem around the year 410, 408 BC as being Johanan. But he's got Johanan ending his high priesthood around 404 or 403 BC, and that is what is highly questionable. It appears that he would not have ended his priest until sometime later, perhaps many years later, because look back with Joshua, look back with Joachim, especially look back with Eliashib, 60-year time period here as high priest. So that means that Johanan, let's say he became high priest when he was maybe 30 and remained high priest for 60 years, maybe for 70 years. That is totally possible. That is a totally possible answer. Which would mean that what Nehemiah has given us is simply a list of those whom he knew to have either been high priests in the past, who were high priests during his time period, or who inevitably would become high priests in the future, which would have meant that he knew Jaddua only as a young boy, maybe a 5-year-old boy. He would have known Jaddua. We do not have to assume that Jaddua was actually old enough to be a high priest during the time period of Nehemiah chapter 12. And in doing this, extending Johanan's high priesthood over into the beginning of the 4th century, perhaps Josephus' date for Jaddua's high priesthood is correct, 351 to 331. That may be a little late, but perhaps that is correct. If those precise dates aren't correct, it's probably somewhere during that time period that Jaddua does become high priest, and therefore wherever Josephus received his information stating the name of the high priest when Alexander came in the 330s BC, it must have been correct. And Nehemiah is not wrong because he's not telling us anywhere here that Jaddua is a high priest. He's in the high priestly line, is all that he's telling us. Therefore, our answer would be that evidently Nehemiah knew Jaddua as a young boy, and knew that he would end up as high priest in the future. Consequently, verse 22 would therefore speak of the Levitical list made when perhaps all 4 men were alive. Eliashib would have been very old. He's not saying that any of these are high priests. Eliashib would have been very old, although one of them would have had to have been during the time period. Joiada, Johanan, and Jaddua. Evidently, and this is possible, having a son, a father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather all alive at the same time period. The great-grandfather, Eliashib, would be very old. The great-grandson, Jaddua, would be very young. And therefore, it would all fit into Nehemiah 12 in a very understandable and believable chronological order. One other problem, I didn't intend to cover this, I'll just mention it in passing, is the end of verse 22 and the mention of the Achaemenid Persian king Darius the Persian. There are many different Darius the Persians as king. Which one was this? Well, evidently it's going to be Darius II. I believe Darius I, Hystaspes, began his reign, I believe, in 521 BC. And after Darius I, Hystaspes, we go through Xerxes, who was Esther's Ahasuerus, then Artaxerxes, then Darius II, then Artaxerxes II. And therefore Darius II would have come during this time period. And he's happened to be called here Darius the Persian. Now the Persian king Darius, that also was during the time of Alexander coming to Jerusalem. Perhaps this was, of course, the one that would have been just prior to that time. Perhaps he could have been called the same thing, Darius the Persian. That's the argument, that it must be referring to the Darius that would have been living just prior to Alexander's time, which would have put this Darius down during the days of when Josephus tells us that Jaddua's high priesthood really existed. But a lot of the different Dariuses were simply known as Darius the Persian. He was Darius, the king of the Persians. Darius the First, Darius the Second, Darius the Second Nophamus, and a whole bunch of other Darius the Seconds. We don't even get, I don't think, to a Darius the Third, but we do go on down to various other Darius the Seconds called by other names, but still who all could be referred to as Darius the Persian. All right, that's a little difficult, but we're through with that. Any questions before we go on? Our next book that presents the problem, we said, was 1 Chronicles. This is found 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 17 through 21. Now, if you understand the Nehemiah 12 bit, then this won't be any problem because it's saying essentially the same thing. 1 Chronicles 3, 17 through 21. The argument is the genealogy of Zerubbabel is extended through 6 generations, which would put the dating of the book of 1 Chronicles far beyond the time of Ezra, whom we believe authored the book. So that's the argument, that the genealogy of Zerubbabel is carried through 6 generations. Now remember, Zerubbabel is just living a few years before Ezra, and if it's carried through 6 generations, the son, grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson, and so forth, then that's going to put at least 1 Chronicles 3, 17 through 21, and maybe all of 1 Chronicles, beyond the time of Ezra, whom we believe authored the book, and whom Jewish tradition informs us authored the book. And of course, what that does again is break down the 400 BC date for the conclusion of the Old Testament canon and throws it up for grabs. So you guess whenever you want to have a conclusion to the Old Testament canon, which means that possibly some of the apocryphal books are meant to be included in the Bible, if you can get beyond 400 BC. You see, none of them were written as early as 400 BC. And so if you can break down this date as being the only accepted final date for the conclusion of the Old Testament canonical writings, then perhaps we can incorporate some of the pseudepigrapha and some of the Jewish apocrypha into the Old Testament canon, because maybe it wasn't closed until 168 BC. Therefore, we could put 1 Maccabees right in there with Daniel. They were written the same date, 168, so we could put both of them in there together. Now, our position on this is that the genealogy of Zerubbabel is carried through 2 generations, not through 6. And I believe this is very evident here. Now, you have to understand some things about Chronicles, the first 9 chapters. He's going through different tribes, giving us genealogies. He, of course, basically is concerned with Judah and with David. But in his genealogies, he's skipping around from one thing to another. He does not do, in other words, like Luke does, in giving us the Father, then the Son, and so forth, all the way on down the line. He'll give us a father, like with Zerubbabel. He's going to give us a father, he's going to give us 2 sons, and he's going to give us a daughter. And then he's going to skip somewhere else. He's going to come back to one of those sons and give us at least one of his children, and then he's going to leave the line of Zerubbabel forever, and he's going to start talking about some other people. And if you don't see that, then it appears that he's going down through 6 successive generations, when in fact all he's doing is going through 2 generations. Now, this is not unique in Jewish writing. Matthew 1 is a good example. Matthew 1 skips names all the time. It fits in, it's trying to get things to fit into an order so that it's easy to memorize. Where you've got 14 generations between Abraham and David, and 14 generations between David and Babylon, and then 14 years after, or 14 generations after the Babylonian captivity, and you add all those up, and 14, 14, 14, they're all easy to memorize then. But he skips names in there, and in some accounts he doubles the names to end up with the number 14 that he wants to have, because the Jews were fond of memorizing their genealogies. I mean, name after name after name. But they would shorten them in leaving out unimportant names or wicked apostate kings or something like that. And thereby call, let's say, David the son of John, when really John was David's great-grandfather. But he skipped a couple of generations because they weren't important and they didn't need to be noted. But it still calls David his son. And it doesn't mean son in the literal sense, but son in the sense of a descendant from John, and so forth. All right, let's look at the verses here. 3 and verse 17. The sons of Jeconiah, Aser, Salathiel his son, Malchiram also, and Pedaiah, Shenazer, Jechemiah, Hoshema, Nedabiah. The sons of Pedaiah were Zerubbabel. All right, here's where Zerubbabel's name is introduced. And this is the Zerubbabel that you're familiar with. All right? Pedaiah has Zerubbabel and Shimei, and the sons of Zerubbabel. So we know we're going to get one generation beyond him now. Meshullam and Hananiah and Shelomith, their sister. So, by the author of Chronicles, we're given two sons, which would still only be one generation, of Zerubbabel, along with one daughter with their sister. Now, remember those two names, because you've got to look now and find out, is it going to name those names again, Meshullam and Hananiah, and give us their sons? So you've got to keep your eyes open for those two names. And then if it gives us their sons' names, you'll have to keep your eyes open for that. All right, verse 19 ends with the sister, Shelomith, their sister. And Hashubah, now notice it doesn't say that Hashubah has anything to do with Zerubbabel. It doesn't say it's a son, a descendant, a cousin, or anything. It just says, and Hashubah, and Ohel, and Berechiah, and Hasadiah, and Jesheb-Heshed, 5. Doesn't say 5 what, though? Couldn't be 5 sons. You add them up and you get more than 5 then. 5 are found right in verse 20. And the sons of Hananiah. He's gone back to Zerubbabel now, because Hananiah was one of those sons there. So now we've got 2 generations. We've got Zerubbabel, we've got a son, and now we're going to end up with a grandson. Hananiah was the name to watch for because it appears again. The sons of Hananiah, Pelatiah, and Jeshai, the sons of Rephaiah, the sons of Arnan, the sons of Obadiah, the sons of Shechaniah, the sons of Shechaniah, and then he goes on and never introduces us again to Zerubbabel, to Hananiah, or to Pelatiah, which means that we don't have 6 generations here. That was merely an invention of man in order to discredit the Ezra authorship of the book. We only have 2 generations beyond Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, his son, and then his grandson. Now that sums up all of the arguments that have been directed against the belief in the close of an Old Testament canon at 400 BC. Therefore, our conclusion is that none of these claims that have been leveled against that date, the finished Old Testament canon of 400 BC, can be justified. But our 4 post-canonical witnesses that we quoted earlier are right and correct. That the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi, around 400 BC, would be when the spirit of revelation left Malachi, or left the Old Testament prophet. This would be during the time of Malachi. Now, our last 2 witnesses that we gave you, Josephus and Talmud, are the ones who are very specific in saying, in dating it to some time period. Josephus put it during the time period of Artaxerxes, and the Talmud said simply that it was after Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, when the spirit of prophecy, the Holy Spirit, departed from Israel. But remember that, and this of course is many, many years after 400 BC, so they could be wrong because they're so far removed from that time period. Remember, however, that our 2 earlier references, the Manual of Discipline and First Maccabees, also are saying something very, very similar, although not dating it. They're still saying that there's not a prophet in Israel because the spirit of revelation is not here in Israel. Now, what we want to look at now, though, is what about Malachi's contemporaries? We can choose to believe Josephus or not believe Josephus. That's up to us. You can choose to believe the Talmud or not believe the Talmud. That would be up to you. But what about right during the time of Malachi himself? He doesn't come along, if you'll turn over to his book now, and say anywhere in his book, well, after I finish, let's say chapter 4 and verse 6 of my prophecy, then the canon of the Old Testament will be completed. Don't listen to any other prophets that arise. Malachi doesn't say that. There had been a succession of high priests without interruption ever since the great prophet Moses arose 1,000 years earlier. And prophets had always followed upon his heels, some giving written revelation, some giving oral revelation that was never intended to be put down in writing. So we've had this 1,000-year period of a succession not of high priests but of high prophets of God prophesying his message to his people. When it comes to Malachi, now that we're looking on this side of Malachi, it stops with Malachi. These writers are looking back on Malachi and obviously seeing that it stops with Malachi. But what about Malachi himself and Malachi's contemporaries? Now we're going to be raising the same question next week about the New Testament, the beginning and the close. We only have to raise the question now about the close of the Old Testament. God didn't shout down out of heaven, you see, this is the end of the Old Testament canon. How did the people know that that was the end of the Old Testament canon? The writer of Maccabees knew that it was, you see. How did they know? Two different ways that you could know. One really objective and one subjective. The first one is if you were a contemporary of Malachi and God hadn't revealed to you divinely and specifically by the Spirit that Malachi's book was the very end. I mean, he didn't tell you that in a dream or something. Then you could go about conducting a little investigation yourself. That was very simple. You'd been given the test back in Deuteronomy 13 and Deuteronomy 18. Simply watch and see if another prophet arose in Israel. And if a prophet arose, then give him the Deuteronomy 13 and 18, among other, tests for prophets and prophecy, and find out whether he was a prophet from the Lord. This part of it, of our study, is a historical study, because you would have had to have been living during Malachi's time and simply watch and see. Did another prophet arise saying, "Thus saith the Lord"? No. You see, no other prophets arose. Now that would have been astounding for his contemporaries, but it would have been something they would have had to have admitted freely. They would have said, no, there is no prophet who is rising up during our time period saying, "Thus saith the Lord." Because, remember, the writer of First Maccabees, the Manual of Discipline, themselves are saying, we're not prophets, and there aren't any prophets during our time period. Now, even though they're a couple of hundred years later looking back, the same principle could have worked with Malachi's contemporaries. It's a mystery, but this is how they would have known a close is coming. This was one of two ways. They could have known that a close is coming. Because don't forget, there had always been a succession of of prophets. There had always been that succession. There had always been prophets. So if you're ending up with a time period when there's no prophet now, if you were discerning, you might guess, well, this is the end then. This is the end of Revelation. Now you would have to tie that in with the second thing that I want to say. And that is, you'd have to properly interpret some small portions of Malachi's book. Remember, the Jews of Malachi's day didn't say, well, we're in for a 400 silent year period now before the Messiah comes. They didn't know there was going to be a 400 silent year period. After Malachi prophesied, they knew up to right now that's the end of prophecy. But what were they looking forward to? We, in looking back, know that they were in for a 400-year period known as the intertestamental period, where there would be no prophetic voice there. But they didn't know that there would be a 400-year silent period. Then a lowly babe would be born in the city of David in Bethlehem, and he would be Christ the Savior, the Messiah, for whom they had all along. They didn't know there'd be a 400-year time period, and then they'd see him, and then there'd be a 2,000-year time period, and then he'd be back again. They only knew of one thing. They were mistaken in what they thought about what they knew. What they knew was right, but their interpretation of it was mistaken. And that is, the next thing they looked for was the coming of the Messiah. And this is what is shown in Malachi's book. And the one thing that preceded, this is very interesting. The one thing that was to precede the coming of that Messiah was a prophet, the prophet Elijah. And therefore they knew after Malachi there will be no prophet until Elijah comes again. And we'll wait for Elijah. They weren't waiting for a 400 silent year period and then a Messiah to be crucified on the cross and then wait 2,000 years for him to come again. They saw, you see, they didn't have this dispensational theology in their mind and seeing everything divided up. They didn't see first advent and second advent. We see that now. The prophets prophesied of first advent, second advent by revelation, But they didn't see first advent, second advent. They saw the Messiah is going to come. They didn't know he would come and then go and then come again. That's what they didn't see. So I want to show you in a couple of portions of his book how the one thing they were looking for was the Messiah, the day of the Lord, and what would come before the day of the Lord would be the return of his messenger prophet. And therefore, they knew that canonical revelation has closed now. If they would have read his book, they'd know this is the end until the Elijah messenger prophet comes. Chapter 3 and verse 1. Behold, now here's Malachi closing the Old Testament. So this is what they're looking for. Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight in, behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. Look in Mark chapter 1. We got to quickly get through here and get it on tape. Mark chapter 1 and verse 2. Mark says, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger. He's quoting Malachi 3:1. Before thy face, which shall prepare thy way before thee. Then he quotes part of Isaiah in verse 3. Going back to Malachi chapter 4 and verse 5. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So they weren't looking for another prophet now to arise and continue giving them canonical revelation. They looked for a great prophet to arise that would turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, and that would prepare a people ready to meet their Maker when he came again. And therefore, they're not looking for another prophet to add to the revelation. They knew with Malachi, revelation closes. Time doesn't close. We're going to wait until Elijah the great prophet comes, and that'll be just before the day of our Messiah. Now, this was fulfilled in part with Jesus' first advent, as we're told in Matthew 17, verses 10 through 12. And his disciples asked him, saying, this is one thing all Jews knew, why then say the scribes that Elijah must first come? Jesus answered and said unto them, Elijah truly shall first come. Notice he said he's going to come and restore all things. But he said, I want to tell you something else about that prophecy. It had two fulfillments. But I say unto you that Elijah is come already. And they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed, and likewise shall also the Son of Man suffer of them. Who was that? Then the disciples understood that he spake unto them of John Baptist. John Baptist was the first Elijah. Jesus said there will be a second Elijah to come. But he said the first Elijah, the first fulfillment of Malachi 4 and verse 5 is the Elijah messenger prophet of John Baptist. Remember, Malachi 3:1 spoke of that messenger that would come before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And then Mark, in Mark 1:2, takes that text and applies it to John the Baptist. Even though that was a day of the Lord, that was not the great and dreadful day of the Lord that is yet to come, when the literal and physical Old Testament prophet Elijah will return again to the earth. John Baptist was a type of Elijah that came the first time. Therefore, all they would need to see are these two things. If they read Malachi properly, they would see. That's why although 2 Chronicles closes the Hebrew Old Testament, Malachi was the close of prophetic voice in the Old Testament. Even though it's not their last book, it's the same as being their last book, because that's the end of prophetic revelation. And they would have seen in his book, we're not looking now for Obadiah or another Jonah or anyone to come along and say, thus saith the Lord. We're looking for the day of the Lord, and just before that, we're looking for the Elijah prophet. And when he comes, we know that the end is here and God will save us from our enemies. What they didn't see was the two advent doctrine. That he would come, they would reject him, he would go away, he would fulfill Isaiah 53 in the crucifixion, he would go away, he would stay gone in a far country for a long time. And then his father would send him back again, and he would come back and then gather his people together, and then the true Elijah, the prophet, would come on the scene. So you see, all they would have had to have done was see that, and they would know this is the close to the Old Testament. So, hallelujah. That's interesting.
Amen. Praise the Lord.
Now, we're going to take the New Testament next week and look at that and see how they can determine the same things about the New Testament.
Hallelujah.
So you wouldn't have to be guessing on the time periods for the canon. If you read the canon yourself, then you would realize when these time periods begin and when they cease. Hallelujah.
Is it possible, I don't know how to say this, but were the people thinking that as such during Malachi's time when there still was a revelation coming through Malachi? That people were thinking we don't want any more revelation, we want the Messiah?
No. They're waiting for, because see, that's chapter 4. That's the end of his ministry and prophecy. They're waiting for Malachi to be through, and then it would take time for them to study and to understand the content of his message. And as soon as that time period had been granted, and they had been successful in interpreting his prophecy, then right away they'd see that the next thing that our prophets have told us to look for is the messenger prophet that would precede the coming of our Messiah. Therefore, that's why the writer of 1 Maccabees, he was a Jew. He knew what Malachi said, and he knew that he himself was waiting for the prophets. They were waiting for a reinstitution of the prophetic line in Elijah the prophet, and of course then it would be culminated in the Messiah, who Deuteronomy 18, Moses has said, is the true and great prophet that will come. And that would be the last of all prophets, would be their Messiah, Jesus.